Hello, in this video I'm going to show you the basics of ring modulation and amplitude modulation using Max MSP. Both of those things are techniques in which an audio signal gets manipulated using another audio signal. This creates something called sideband frequencies, new partials that appear according to the frequencies of both signals. This adds this nice, rich, eerie, metallic sound quality to the incoming signal, and this can be used for synthesizing sound, creating synthesizers, as well as audio effects and processing live and recorded audio for exploring new timbres. Let's see how this is done. Alright, let's start by creating the EasyDAC object that is going to be our final audio output. I'm also going to type its name here. We also need to create live.gain tilde for changing the volume of this audio signal, as well as limit tilde with the argument 2, so we have a 2-channel peak limiter. So if the audio clips or peaks, I don't know, something bad happens to it, our ears and our speakers are going to be safe. Perfect. Now that we have this, let's create a very basic sound. The sine wave. The sine wave, so the cycle tilde object, let's say with the argument 220. So frequency of 220, that's roughly the note A or something like the note A, and it sounds predictably like this. Now, you might know what I'm doing right now. I am changing the amplitude of this audio signal. And that is something we have to talk about before delving into ring modulation, because if we are going to understand and work with ring modulation, we have to understand and also work with eventually amplitude modulation, because those two terms and concepts and techniques are closely related with one another. So let's take apart this term amplitude modulation. Right? I can think of the term amplitude and I can think of the term modulation. Now, amplitude is the loudness of a signal. I can go more technical, I can talk about changes in pressure, I can talk about ratios between change in pressure. Doesn't matter right now. Amplitude is the loudness of a sound. We can change it in Max MSP by using certain objects or flat out multiplying the audio signal by a scalar value, by a number, where multiplying it by 1 would make it as loud, it wouldn't change it. If we multiply it by 0.5, it would be half as loud. If we multiply this audio signal by 2, it would be twice as loud and would probably clip, and then we would be happy that we have limit tilde right here, right before EasyDAC. And that is amplitude. And what is modulation? Now, modulation in DSP is a very broad term. Modulation refers to taking an audio signal and changing that audio signal in some way or form using another audio signal. In this case, the original audio signal is sometimes called the carrier signal, and the other signal changing this is called the modulator signal. Now, if we are going to perform, well, let's put these back together, amplitude modulation, we have to change the amplitude of this sine wave oscillator. Right, and as I've said, we can simply do this by multiplying the audio signal that comes out of this oscillator. So asterisk tilde, and for now let's put 1. And as I've said, we are just going to hear the same audio signal. But as I have said, we are trying to perform modulation, so instead of changing this value by hand, I'm going to be creating another oscillator. Let's create cycle with the argument 1. So now this has a frequency of 1. We will not be able to hear this. The human ear cannot hear frequencies lower than about 20. But we can look at this by using live.scope. Live.scope tilde is going to visualize this audio signal. And as you can see, this is the sine wave. This is the sine wave. It looks beautiful. It looks sinusoid because it is a sine wave. And we can also note that this is a bipolar signal. This means that the values, the oscillation, actually goes between -1 and +1. If this was unipolar, this would go from 0 to 1 and then back, but in this case it's oscillating from -1 to +1, 2 and back, and 2 and back again. This is going to be important later on. I'm not just nerding out about audio wave types. Now, what is going to happen if I plug this into the second outlet of my asterisk tilde object? Alright, this is the tremolo effect, right? And I can make this faster and I'm going to have a faster tremolo. I'm right now not distorting or modulating the signal in any way or form. This is the tremolo effect. But now, the fun thing is going to happen when I increase this tremolo above a certain threshold. Well, look at this, I'm hearing multiple tones. Here it is again. And in fact, you might notice that we are not hearing the sine wave frequency of 220 at all in this resulting signal. We are hearing two other frequencies, two other sine wave frequencies. And that's what we have just performed is ring modulation. So ring modulation is changing the amplitude of a carrier signal by using another signal, usually an oscillator, in such a way that it removes the carrier signal from the result. So we are only hearing the sum and difference tones. We are only hearing the sideband frequencies. That's what those two frequencies we are now hearing are called. And the mathematics behind this is fairly simple. Well, I mean, if you really get into it, it's not that simple, but the result is simple to understand. Sideband frequencies, in this case, refers to the two new frequencies we hear, which is the sum and the difference between the frequencies of the carrier signal and the modulator signal. In this case, this means we are hearing 220 minus 100, so 120, and another signal, another sine wave signal with frequency of 220 plus 100, so 320. So we are hearing two signals, two sine wave signals at frequencies of 120 and 320. And as I change the frequency of the modulator signal, this ratio and the resulting frequencies are going to change with it. Alright, now this is not too exciting, is it? Because if I really wanted to, I could also create an algorithm in MSP that, just calculates these frequencies and plays them out individually. So why do we have to do this way? What is the benefit of doing it in this way? Well, we do not have to use sine waves neither for the carrier signal nor the modulator signal. If we use more complex audio signals, if we use more complex waves, something really cool happens. If the carrier signal has more than one sine wave or partial contained in it, something really cool happens where all of those partials generate their unique individual pairs of sideband frequencies. So for instance, if I create, I don't know, a rectangular oscillator, right? Rect tilde with the, well, first let's give it the argument 1 so we see how it looks like, and here is a rectangular waveform, fairly simple. If you really want to know how it sounds like, here is how a rectangular wave sounds. And now let's use this as the carrier signal. So instead of cycle tilde 220, I'm going to type in rect tilde 220. And here is how it's going to sound. It's like a beautiful drone. And I can make this even more crazy, right? For instance, instead of using a sine wave oscillator for my modulator signal, why don't I use a sawtooth wave? So sawtooth wave, not sawtooth whale. I do not think that is possible in MSP as of the making in this video, but we can create a sawtooth wave. And saw tilde is an anti-alias sawtooth oscillator. So if we create this, play around with the frequency a bit, we are going to hear an even dirtier, richer sound. And you can create all kinds of cool things with this. For example, usually amplitude modulation is used as a basis for sound synthesis, but this can be an audio effect as well. But before we look into more complicated or more interesting uses of this, let's bring in this nice little comment box all the way to the top, because we have to talk about the difference between ring modulation and the amplitude modulation. Now, as I've said, in ring modulation, we do not hear the original signal. Now, we can see this if I switch back to sine wave oscillators. Yet again, if I have 220 and I type in 100 for the frequency of my modulator signal, well, I do not hear the sine wave with the frequency of 220 anymore. But with amplitude modulation, I should be able to hear the original audio signal as well as the result of amplitude modulation. And how do I do this? Well, to do this, we have to fix one little problem with the modulator signal. And that is the fact that, and I'm trying to visualize a sine wave oscillator to show you what I'm trying to say, that is the fact that this is bipolar, and bipolar signals, bipolar modulator signals, always generate ring modulation. They eliminate the carrier signal from the equation. So if we want to switch to true amplitude modulation, what we have to do is to make this unipolar, as in make these values go from -1 to 1 to 0 to 1. And there are a few ways of doing this. We can simply use a scale object, but this time I feel like doing some more math. So here is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to first add to this signal the value of 1. Right, so plus tilde 1. So now I'm oscillating between 0 and 2. Instead of -1 to 1, I'm oscillating between 0 and 2. Meaning if I divide this audio signal, so division tilde and then 2, if I divide this by 2, well, I'm going to have a range of between 0 and 1 instead of -1 to +1. Right, so if I do this operation on my modulator signal, I should be able to achieve amplitude modulation. Right, so modulator signal +1 and then divided by 2. And here's the same thing, but this time with amplitude modulation. Do you hear it? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe at least you hear the fact that there are 3 distinct tones in the resulting synthesis. So if I change the carrier signal as well, you would also hear a change in the entire tone, including the carrier signal. Now, this means that the result of amplitude modulation is going to be even more complex and rich in partials. For instance, if I use a triangular oscillator for my carrier signal, so tri tilde, and if I use a rectangular oscillator, and you can try all kinds of variations, of course, but I'm going to use a rectangular oscillator for my modulator signal. And since I'm doing amplitude modulation, I'm going to get a sound like this. All right, now this is really cool, but we can keep on experimenting with this. For instance, as I've said in the beginning, the carrier signal does not have to be an oscillator. In fact, none of these signals have to be an oscillator, but for the purposes of showing you the basics of ring modulation and amplitude modulation, I'm going to be focusing on the carrier signal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out some kind of audio sample, some kind of audio file, and I'm going to play that out and then put that through ring and amplitude modulation. So let's take, for example, from my sound bank, Airy Roads. And just so we know how it sounds on its own, here it is. Some beautiful chords. Now, what is going to happen if I use this as a carrier signal? Here it goes. Wow, that is really freaky. And of course I can change the frequency of the modulator wave, right? I can change the frequency of the modulator signal. And to have even finer control in this algorithm, I can actually find a way to choose the amount of sideband frequencies and the amount of the carrier signal present in the final result. And here is how I'm going to do this. So to figure out how much of the carrier wave is present in the final result, I just have to, well, change the amplitude of the modulator signal before that changes the amplitude of the carrier signal, right? So I have to take my rectangular oscillator in this case. I can stop playing this audio file even though we do not hear it. Anyway, I'm taking this rectangular oscillator here and I'm going to multiply it by 1, right? Asterisk tilde 1, so I get the same result. But since I have this object in my pipeline now, I can use the second inlet of this object to change the amplitude in real time. And for this I can use a floating number box, but I feel a bit more fancy, so instead I'm going to create live.dial. Live.dial is going to create this nice dial interface that we can use to set values of things and parameters of things as we create algorithms. And a nice way of working with this is to right-click the object, right-click live.dial, and then choose prototype, and then select amount. That's going to change the interface. It's going to give it this nice percentage-based dial, and it's going to make sure that the second outlet of the object is still going to give me a value between 0 and 1, even though the object itself shows a percentage. So if I plug this in here, well, what am I going to get? I'm going to multiply the modulator signal based on this amount. Meaning I can do things like this. As you can see, if I turn it all the way down, I'm not getting anything. If I turn it up, I start hearing the sideband frequencies. All right, now, to do the same thing, but to eliminate the carrier signal somehow from the equation, I have to do, well, the same thing, but to the plus tilde object. So when I add this offset to the incoming audio signal in order to make sure that it is unipolar, well, I can play around with that value. I can make it lower than 1, but still higher than 0, and it's going to be less pronounced. The carrier signal is going to be present, but it's going to be less pronounced. And if I want, I can even make it go higher than 1, and then the carrier signal is going to be even louder. But for now, I'm just going to make this between 0 and 1. And let's see if this works as intended. There we go. So now we are hearing pretty much nothing, right? I can turn on the second dial, and that is for the carrier signal. And we are simply hearing our carrier signal. I can turn on the sideband frequencies dial. And we are only hearing the resulting sideband frequencies, and I can mix these in any way I want to achieve any kind of sounds. Of course, if I use a sine wave oscillator, as I have said, we get purer tones, less partials, so it's a more metallic sound. And finally, if you are working with these kinds of effects or these kinds of sound generation, a little bit of reverb goes a long way. So I'm going to go to plugins here, and I'm going to add in Valhalla Supermassive, which is a free reverb I use for a lot of my projects. Even though these guys are not sponsoring me, I'm just going to put the link in the video description. And again, it's free, so there is no harm in trying it out. So I'm going to add this right after live.gain, but before Limmy. So I'm still going to make sure that peak limits is happening. And I then have to click on this wrench, go to preset, choose, let's say, reverbs, small triangulum chamber. And let's see how this sounds with some reverb added in. And look at this, we transform this airy roads, some jazzy chords into some church bells from hell, just by using some simple principles of amplitude modulation. And again, this can just be the beginning. If this does interest you, you can try to turn this into a synth. You can try to add some other audio effects or try to modulate this algorithm in other ways. For example, you can also modulate the frequency of the modulator signal with some other kind of modulator signal. So you can try to stack carrier and modulator signals in different ways to try and achieve even crazier kinds of sounds. In any case, I hope this has been insightful and or helpful to you, and thank you for watching.